For 8 years, the biker boss's son clutched his throat every time someone spoke, unable to answer, unable to scream. His father, Larry Henry, a man who controlled half the city's streets with nothing but a leather cut and a reputation for violence, threw money at specialists from Miami to Seattle, flew in private doctors, threatened hospital boards, burned through millions. They all came back with the same answer: there's nothing we can do. Then a maid with a dead child of her own saw what every expert missed, and what she pulled from that boy's throat didn't just shock the father. It exposed a lie that had lasted 8 years. If you're back for another story that'll shatter everything you thought you knew about power and helplessness, drop a comment right now telling me which side you're on, because by the end of this, you'll question everyone. And hit that subscribe button before this story rips your heart out. Larry Henry. Say that name in the right bar, on the right block, and you'd watch men twice his size go quiet mid-sentence. Not because Larry was the biggest, not because he was the loudest. Because when Larry Henry decided something needed handling, it got handled. No questions, no delays, no second chances. At 42, Larry ran the Black Smoke MC, a brotherhood of riders who didn't just move product across state lines. They owned the lines, trucking routes, border contacts, cops on speed dial who'd look the other way for the right envelope. Other clubs knew better than to test him. Rival crews learned quick. You either paid tribute or you disappeared into the kind of silence that makes people stop asking questions. Politicians smiled at fundraisers and avoided eye contact. Judges owed favors they'd never admit to. And the few cops who weren't on payroll? They learned to focus on smaller fish. Larry Henry was untouchable. But inside the compound he'd built outside the city, 10 acres of chain-link fence, motion sensors, and armed men who never slept. There was one thing Larry's power couldn't fix. His son hadn't spoken in 8 years. The house sat like a fortress pretending to be a home. Modern, expensive, clean, floor-to-ceiling windows that let in light but never warmth. Leather furniture no one sat on. A kitchen that smelled like disinfectant instead of food. And silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the kind that comes with peace. This was the silence of a tomb. Thick. Choking. The kind that pressed against your chest and made you want to leave the room just to remember what your own voice sounded like. No music played in Larry Henry's house. No TV in the background. No laughter echoing down the halls. Because Dan, his 8-year-old son, couldn't laugh, couldn't cry out loud, couldn't scream. And Larry had learned a long time ago that filling the house with sound only made the boy's silence feel heavier. So he kept it quiet. And everyone who worked there learned to do the same. Pause right here, before I tell you who found the truth. I need you to understand something. Every single expert failed this child. So smash that like button if you're already furious at what's coming, and drop a comment telling me, would you have walked away or risked everything? Because what happens next will make you choose a side. But to understand how a woman with no medical training saw what specialists missed, and why she risked her life to act when no one else would, you need to know who Linda Donegan was, and what she'd already lost. Linda Donegan hadn't always been the kind of woman who answered ads for jobs no one else wanted. 5 years ago, she'd had a husband, a daughter, a small house with a garden she actually cared about. She'd been the kind of mother who packed lunches with little notes inside, who knew every stuffed animal's name, who could tell when her daughter's cough meant nothing, or when it meant call the doctor now. Except the one time it mattered most, she'd been told she was overreacting. It's just a cold, the pediatrician had said, barely looking up from his tablet. Kids get sick. Stop worrying so much. 3 days later, Emma stopped breathing in the middle of the night. Bacterial pneumonia. Caught too late. Gone before the ambulance made it halfway to the hospital. The marriage didn't survive the funeral. Her husband couldn't look at her without blame in his eyes. Why didn't you push harder? And Linda couldn't look at herself without asking the same question. She'd lost the house 6 months later, lost most of her friends when the grief made her too heavy to be around. And when her mother's cancer diagnosis came with a $4,000 a month treatment bill, Linda realized she'd run out of time to fall apart. So she took work wherever she could find it. Cleaning offices, scrubbing hospital floors at night, jobs where no one asked questions, and the pay came in cash. Which is how she ended up standing outside the Black Smoke MC compound on a cold October morning, staring at a job posting that promised triple the usual rate and came with warnings whispered in every employment office in the city. People who work for Larry Henry don't last. The last housekeeper just stopped showing up. You ever see those missing persons cases that go cold? Yeah. Linda had hesitated at the gate for a full 10 minutes before pressing the intercom. She was met inside by a woman who introduced herself only as Ms. Vega, head of household staff, steel gray hair pulled tight, expression carved from stone. The rules were delivered in a hallway that smelled like expensive leather and something Linda couldn't name. Fear, maybe. You clean. You stay quiet. You do not look Mr. Henry in the eye. Ever. Linda nodded. You do not speak to his son. You do not approach him. You do not acknowledge his existence unless directly instructed. Linda's chest tightened. Why? You don't ask questions either. Ms. Vega's eyes went cold. The girl before you thought she could be friendly, thought she could help. She lasted 3 days. A pause. No one's seen her since. Linda should have walked out, should have run. But her mother's prescriptions were due in 2 days, and she had $17 in her account. I understand, Linda said quietly. Ms. Vega studied her for a long moment, then turned. Follow me. They walked deeper into the house, through hallways too quiet, past rooms too clean, under the watch of men in leather cuts who tracked her like wolves watching prey. And then Ms. Vega stopped, pointed through an open doorway. The boys' playroom. You'll clean it last, after he's gone to bed. Linda looked, and there, sitting alone on the floor, surrounded by toys he wasn't playing with, was an 8-year-old boy with his hand pressed against his throat, wincing like something inside hurt too much to name. Dan Henry, the child no one was allowed to see. If this is breaking your heart already, you need to subscribe right now, because what Linda discovers will either restore your faith in humanity or destroy it completely. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss what she finds in that child's throat. And comment below. Have you ever noticed something everyone else missed? Dan Henry sat in the center of a room designed for joy, and touched none of it. Shelves lined 3 walls, packed with toys still in their boxes. Action figures, building sets, remote control cars that had never left their packaging. A drum kit in the corner, drums still wrapped in protective plastic. A basketball hoop mounted at kid height, net untouched. Everything a child could want. And Dan sat on the floor with a single wooden block, turning it over and over in his hands. Same motion, same angle, over and over. Linda stood in the doorway with a dust cloth she didn't need, watching. No one else did. A guard passed behind her in the hallway, boots heavy on marble, and didn't even glance inside. One of the other housekeepers walked by carrying folded linens, eyes deliberately forward, as if the room were empty. They'd all learned. Don't look. Don't engage. Don't acknowledge. The boy doesn't exist. But Linda couldn't look away, because she'd seen this before. The isolation, the repetitive movements, the way a child retreats inward when the world stops trying to reach them. Emma used to line up her stuffed animals the same way every night when she was anxious. Same order, same spacing, a need for control when everything else felt wrong. Dan flipped the block, inspected it, set it down, picked it up again. And then, so quick, Linda almost missed it. His hand lifted to his throat, pressed, flinched, dropped back down. Linda's breath caught. She told herself she'd imagined it, told herself it was nothing. A scratch, a nervous tick. Kids touch themselves all the time for no reason. But something in her chest tightened anyway. The days blurred together after that. Linda cleaned in silence, mopped floors that didn't need mopping. We went down surfaces no one touched, moved through the house like a ghost among ghosts, invisible to everyone except the security cameras that tracked her every step. And every time she passed Dan's playroom, she looked. He was always alone, sometimes in the same spot, sometimes by the window, staring out at nothing. Sometimes at a table with crayons he didn't use, paper he didn't draw on. Staff walked past him like he was furniture. Guards stood outside his door, but never inside. And Larry Henry, the man who could command a room with a look, who made grown men sweat with a single question, never came to see his son. Not once in the week Linda had been there, but Dan's hand kept rising. To his throat, to his neck. Pressing, wincing, dropping. Linda counted. 4 times the first day she noticed. 7 the second. 11 on the third. It wasn't random. It wasn't mindless. It was consistent. Targeted. Like a child checking a wound that wouldn't heal, prodding a bruise that wouldn't fade. On the 8th day, Linda was cleaning the hallway outside Dan's room when she heard a sound. Soft, muffled, barely there. A whimper. She froze, dust cloth forgotten. Looked inside. Dan sat on the floor, hand pressed hard against his throat, face scrunched in pain. Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes, but he made no other sound. Didn't cry out, didn't call for help, because he'd learned too. No one came when you hurt. Linda's hands trembled. Emma used to do that. Pull at her ear when the infection got bad, crying silently in the middle of the night because she didn't want to wake anyone, didn't want to be a burden. And Linda had known, had felt it in her gut that something was wrong. But the pediatrician had said she was overreacting. And she'd listened. And Emma had died. Linda stared at Dan, at the way his small hand pressed and pressed against his throat, and the realization hit her like cold water. This wasn't a habit. This was pain. And no one was paying attention. Listen to me carefully. If you've ever been ignored by someone who was supposed to help you, smash that like button right now. Because what happens next is going to make you scream at your screen. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you even doing? Hit that button before this story breaks you. Linda started counting, not because she wanted to, because she couldn't stop. 13 times on Thursday. Dan's hand rising to his throat, pressing, wincing, falling away. 16 times on Friday, 22 on Saturday, A bad day, apparently, because his face stayed tight with pain even when his hand dropped. No one else counted. No one else looked. But Linda couldn't unsee it now. Couldn't unhear the soft whimper he'd made when he thought no one was listening. She told herself to stay quiet, to follow the rules, to remember what Ms. Vega had said about the last girl who tried to help. No one's seen her since. But every time Linda walked past that playroom, every time she saw Dan sitting, alone with toys he didn't touch, and pain he couldn't voice, Emma's face flickered in her mind, and the question she'd been asking herself for 5 years whispered again. What if you'd tried harder? It happened on a Tuesday. Linda was dusting the hallway when she heard it, a sharp crack, followed by a muffled sound of frustration. She looked in. Dan sat on the floor, staring at a wooden puzzle that had split in half, pieces scattered, one section broken clean through, unusable now. He stared at it yet, not crying, not moving, just staring, like he'd expected it to break, like everything always did. Linda's chest ached. She shouldn't. She knew she shouldn't. But her feet carried her into the room before her brain could stop them. She knelt on the floor, picked up the broken pieces and fit them back together, holding them in place with one hand while she reached for the tape dispenser on a nearby shelf. Dan's head snapped up. His eyes went wide. Shocked. Not afraid. Not angry. Just stunned. Like he couldn't believe someone had crossed the invisible line everyone else respected. Linda said nothing. Just taped the pieces together, tested the hold, and set the puzzle back in front of him. Then she stood and walked out. She didn't look back, but she felt his eyes on her the entire way down the hall. The next day, Dan left her a drawing, not handed to her, not placed where she'd see it, just left on the floor near where she'd knelt the day before. A crayon sketch of 2 stick figures, one small, one tall, both smiling. Linda stared at it for a long time, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket. After that, something shifted. Dan started watching for her. When she passed his room, he'd look up, make eye contact, hold it for just a second longer than coincidence. She'd nod, small, barely there. He'd nod back. It became routine, a silent language built on gestures no one else noticed. "Are you okay?" A slight head tilt. "I'm here." A hand over her heart. "Thank you." A small, fleeting smile. The first time Dan smiled, really smiled, eyes crinkling at the corners, something bright breaking through the isolation. Linda's throat closed up so tight she had to turn away before he saw her cry. She didn't know Larry had seen it too. Didn't know he'd been walking past, coffee in hand, headed somewhere else entirely, when he'd stopped. Frozen in the hallway, staring through the doorway at his son's face, at an expression he hadn't seen in years. Larry stood there for 30 seconds, maybe more, watching Linda dust a shelf while Dan played quietly nearby, glancing at her every few moments like he was making sure she was still real. Then Larry turned and walked away without a word. That night, Ms. Vega pulled Linda aside. "I don't know what you think you're doing," the older woman said, voice low and sharp. "But it stops. Now." Linda's stomach dropped. You're breaking the rules." Ms. Vega stepped closer. "And when you break the rules in this house, you don't get a warning. You get disappeared." Linda swallowed hard. "I wasn't. You were." Ms. Vega's eyes were cold, hard, But underneath, Linda could have sworn there was something else. Fear, maybe. The boy doesn't need you. He doesn't need anyone. That's how Mr. Henry wants it. And what Mr. Henry wants, he gets. She leaned in. The last girl thought she could save him too. Thought she was special. A pause. She wasn't. Linda nodded slowly. I understand. Ms. Vega studied her, then turned and walked away. But Linda didn't understand. She understood the threat, understood the danger. What she didn't understand was how everyone in this house could watch a child in pain, day after day, hour after hour, and do nothing. How they could pretend he didn't exist. How they could convince themselves that silence was safety. Because Linda had done that once. Listened to an expert who told her she was overreacting. Stayed quiet when every instinct screamed to push harder. And her daughter had died. Linda stood in the hallway long after Ms. Vega left, staring at the closed door to Dan's room. Remembering the way his hand pressed against his throat. The way he flinched. The way no one else seemed to care. And she made a decision. She had to know what was wrong, even if it killed her. If you're sitting there thinking, this woman is about to risk everything, you're absolutely right. Share this video with someone who needs to see what real courage looks like. And if you haven't liked this video yet, do it now before you forget. Because what she finds in Larry's office will make your blood boil. Larry Henry left the compound every Thursday night. Some kind of meeting. Business. Linda didn't ask about and didn't want to know. What mattered was this. For 3 hours, the house got quieter. Guards rotated shifts. Ms. Vega retired early. And Larry's private study, the one-room staff were explicitly forbidden from entering, sat unattended. Linda stood outside the door at 11:47 p.m., heart hammering against her ribs. This was insane. If she got caught, she wouldn't just lose the job. She'd lose a lot more than that. But Dan's face kept flashing in her mind. The way he'd pressed his throat that afternoon, harder than usual, longer than usual, tears streaming silently while he rocked back and forth, trying to soothe pain no one else acknowledged. Linda turned the handle. The door opened. The study was exactly what she'd expected. Leather chairs, dark wood, bookshelves that probably held more intimidation than literature, and filing cabinets. 3 of them. Linda pulled open the first drawer. Medical records. Dozens of them. She spread files across the desk, hands shaking as she flipped through page after page. Seattle Children's Hospital. Diagnosis. Elective mutism. Psychological origin. Recommended therapy. Cost. $47,000. Johns Hopkins specialist consultation. Diagnosis. Selective mutism. Secondary to trauma. Prescribed. Cognitive behavioral therapy. Cost. $63,000. Mayo Clinic evaluation. Diagnosis. Functional speech disorder. Etiology unclear. Referred to speech pathology. Cost. $81,000. On and on. Different cities. Different specialists. Different words wrapped around the same conclusion. We don't know. We can't fix it. Keep paying us to try. Linda's stomach turned. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, years of consultations. And every single report said some version of the same thing. It's psychological, it's trauma, it's something we can't see and therefore can't solve. But nowhere did Linda find a simple throat exam. No laryngoscopy, no endoscopy, no basic physical examination of the vocal cords, the airway, the structures that actually produced sound. They'd run brain scans, ordered psychological evaluations, prescribed medications, but no one had looked inside. Linda's hands stilled on a report dated 2 years ago. A specialist in Boston who'd noted, almost as an afterthought, patient exhibits pain response when palpating anterior neck region, cause undetermined, recommend follow-up. No follow-up was listed. She flipped to the next report. A different doctor, different city. No mention of the pain, like it had been. Forgotten, ignored, dismissed as unimportant. Or, Linda's breath caught, deliberately overlooked. She thought of Emma, of the pediatrician who'd waved off her concerns because kids get colds, who hadn't listened when Linda said something feels wrong, because listening meant more tests, more time, more effort. And Emma had died because probably nothing was easier than, let's be sure. Linda stared at the files spread before her, at the pattern she couldn't unsee. These doctors hadn't missed the problem. They'd avoided it. Because a mystery they couldn't solve kept the checks coming, kept Larry desperate, kept the appointments booked and the referrals flowing. But a simple physical blockage, that was a one-time fix. No follow-ups, no long-term care, no $80,000 consultations every 6 months. Linda's hands trembled as she closed the files. She should leave. Right now. Put everything back. Walk away. This wasn't her fight. Dan wasn't her son. And if Larry found out she'd been in here, a sound from the hallway froze her in place. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Linda's heart stopped. She shoved the files back into the drawer, pushed it shut as quietly as she could, and ducked behind the desk just as the door creaked open. She held her breath. Waited. The footsteps paused, then continued past. A guard. Just a guard on rounds. Linda exhaled shakily, waited another 3 minutes, then slipped out of the study and back toward the staff quarters. She didn't sleep that night, because she'd made a decision. If no one else would look, if no one else would care, then Linda would. She'd check Dan's throat herself, and if she found what she thought she'd find, God help the people who'd ignored it. Stop. Before you see what happens next, I need you to understand. Linda is about to do something that could get her killed. If you think she's making the right choice, comment, do it right now. If you think she's insane, comment, run, and smash that subscribe button, because what she pulls out of that boy's throat will haunt you forever. Larry left on a Friday. Some kind of run to the state line. Territory dispute that needed his presence. Ms. Vega had mentioned it in passing. He'd be gone overnight, maybe longer. Linda had nodded like it didn't matter, but her hands had been shaking ever since, because tonight was the only chance she'd get. She'd stolen supplies from the first aid kit in the staff bathroom. Medical tweezers, a pen light, sterile gauze, antiseptic wipes she wasn't even sure she'd need, but took anyway, because her hands needed something to do besides tremble. At 10 p.m., when the house had gone quiet and the guard rotations left a 15-minute gap in the east hallway, Linda slipped into Dan's room. He was awake, sitting up in bed, clutching a stuffed rabbit someone had probably bought him years ago that he'd never played with. When he saw her, his eyes went wide. Not with fear, with something else. Something that made Linda's chest ache. Hope. She crossed to the bed and knelt beside it, pulling out the pen light and holding it where he could see. Then she pointed to his throat, pointed to herself, pointed back to him. Let me look. Dan stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, carefully. He nodded and tilted his head back. Linda's hands shook as she angled the light into his mouth, pressing his tongue down gently with a wooden depressor she'd wrapped in gauze. At first, she saw nothing, just the normal pink tissue of a healthy throat. But then she adjusted the angle and froze. There, just visible past the soft palate, lodged deep where the throat narrowed, was a mass. Dark, irregular, hardened. It looked like bone, like a growth, like something that had always been there and always would be. But Linda had seen this before, in Emma, an impacted piece of food that had calcified over weeks, hardening until it looked like part of the body itself. The doctors had called it a phytobezoar, dismissed it as harmless until it wasn't, until Emma couldn't breathe, and it was too late to... Linda squeezed her eyes shut, forced the memory down, opened them again. Dan was watching her, waiting, trusting her completely. "Don't do this," a voice whispered in her head. "You're not a doctor. You could hurt him. You could kill him. And when Larry finds out..." But if she didn't do this, Dan would live in pain for the rest of his life, and no one would ever look closely enough to see why. Linda pulled out the tweezers, sterilized them with an antiseptic wipe, took a breath that felt like swallowing glass, and reached inside. The tweezers scraped against the mass, hard, unyielding, wedged so tightly Linda couldn't get a grip at first. Dan flinched, whimpered. Linda froze. I'm sorry, baby. Just a little more." She adjusted the angle, tried again. This time, the tweezers caught an edge. She pulled. The mass didn't budge. Linda's hands were slick with sweat. Her heart hammered so hard, she thought Dan could probably hear it. She pulled harder, a tiny shift, barely anything. But it moved. Dan's eyes watered. His hands clenched the blanket, but he didn't pull away. "You're so brave," Linda whispered. So brave. Just a little more." She gripped tighter, pulled with steady, even pressure, and felt the obstruction give. It came free in pieces at first, crumbling, breaking apart, and then all at once, the entire mass slid loose and landed in the tweezers with a wet, sickening plop. Linda pulled it out, stared at it. It was the size of a marble, dark brown, calcified, streaked with something that looked disturbingly like old blood. She set it on the gauze beside her, looked at Dan. His mouth was open, eyes wider than she'd ever seen them. And then he gasped, a real gasp, full, deep, like he'd been drowning and just broke the surface. His hand flew to his throat, not pressing this time, touching, feeling. His lips moved, and sound came out. Not words, not yet, but sound. A broken, raspy exhale that turned into something closer to a sob. Linda's eyes filled with tears. "You're okay," she whispered. "You're..." Footsteps pounded down the hallway, heavy, fast. The door slammed open, and Larry Henry stood there, chest heaving, eyes wild, staring at Linda kneeling beside his son with tweezers in one hand and blood on the other. His face went white, then taut, then mything beyond rage. "What the fuck did you do?" If your heart is pounding right now, smash that like button before Larry does what you think he's going to do. And if you're not subscribed, you're missing the most intense moment of this entire story. Hit that bell. You need to see what Dan does next. Comment if you think Linda survives this. Larry crossed the room in 3 strides. His hand closed around Linda's throat before she could speak, before she could explain. before she could do anything except choke on the words that wouldn't come. He slammed her against the wall, lifted her clean off the floor, his face inches from hers, eyes black with something beyond rage. "You touched my son," he snarled. "You made him bleed." Linda clawed at his hand. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't see. The room tilted, darkened at the edges. This was it. She was going to die. And then, a sound tore through the room, raw, guttural, uncontrolled. A scream. Larry's hand went slack. Linda dropped, gasping, collapsing to her knees as air flooded back into her lungs. Larry spun. Dan stood on the bed, chest heaving, face red, tears streaming, and his mouth was open. Screaming. Not words, just sound. Pure, unfiltered sound that 8 years of silence had locked away. Larry staggered backward like he'd been shot. "Dan!" The boy screamed again, louder. This time, longer. His hands flew to his throat, not in pain, in shock, feeling the vibration for the first time, hearing his own voice. And then he looked at Larry, reached for him. "Dad." The word came out mangled, broken, a sound shaped by a throat that didn't know how to form it yet. But it was there. Larry's knees buckled. He caught himself on the edge of the bed, staring at his son like he was seeing a ghost. "You!" His voice cracked. "You can!" Dan nodded, tears pouring. He lunged forward, wrapped his arms around Larry's neck, and sobbed, audibly, desperately, into his father's shoulder. And Larry Henry, the man who'd built an empire on fear, who'd never shown weakness, who'd buried his grief so deep he'd forgotten how to feel it, broke. He held his son and shook with sobs he couldn't control, couldn't hide, couldn't stop. Behind them, Linda sat slumped against the wall, throat bruised, vision swimming. She should run, should disappear before Larry remembered what he'd almost done. But she couldn't move, couldn't do anything except watch a father hear his son's voice for the first time in 8 years. The moment shattered when Ms. Vega appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 guards. Her face went pale when she saw the scene. "Get her out of here," Larry said, voice hoarse, not looking up from Dan. "Lock her in the security room. Don't let her leave." The guards moved. Linda didn't fight as they hauled her to her feet, didn't resist as they dragged her toward the door. She looked back once. Dan was watching her, clutching his father, mouth moving soundlessly. "Thank you." Then the door closed, and Linda was swallowed by the dark. Before you find out if Linda lives or dies, I need you to do something. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what real sacrifice looks like. And if you're angry at those doctors who ignored this child for 8 years, let me hear it in the comments. Subscribe if you want justice. Larry carried Dan to the car himself, barked orders to the driver, held his son in the back seat as they tore through empty streets toward the nearest hospital, Dan's hand pressed to his throat the entire way. Not in pain, in wonder, making sounds, testing his voice, crying and laughing and gasping all at once. Larry couldn't speak, couldn't think, could only hold his boy and feel the vibrations of sound he'd thought he'd never hear. At the hospital, doctors swarmed, examined Dan's throat, asked questions Larry couldn't answer. And when the ENT specialist finally emerged from the examination room, her face was pale. "Mr. Henry," she said carefully, "we need to talk about what was in your son's throat." Larry's jaw tightened. "Talk." The doctor hesitated. "It was a bezoar, calcified organic matter. It's been there for years." She paused, and it should have been caught on any basic throat exam. Larry's blood went cold. "Are you telling me?" "I'm telling you," the doctor said quietly, "that whoever removed it tonight saved your son's life." She met his eyes. "And whoever missed it for 8 years should never practice medicine again." Larry sat in a hospital conference room surrounded by doctors who wouldn't meet his eyes. On the table between them, Dan's medical records, 8 years' worth, stacked 2 feet high, and one small, dark mass preserved in a specimen jar. The ENT specialist, Dr. Okoye, cleared her throat. "Mr. Henry, we've completed our analysis. Your son's vocal capacity is at approximately 85% functionality. With speech therapy, we expect full recovery within 6 months." Larry's hands were flat on the table. Steady. Too steady. "How long was it there?" "Based on the calcification patterns, we estimate 6 to 7 years." 6 to 7 years. Larry's jaw worked. "And these?" He gestured to the files. "All these doctors, all these specialists, all these experts I paid." "We've reviewed the records," Dr. Okoye said carefully. "Several physicians noted pharyngeal abnormalities, unusual density in the throat region. One report from Boston explicitly recommended a laryngoscopy to what?" She hesitated. "To investigate a possible foreign body obstruction." "And?" "The recommendation was never followed up on." Silence. Larry leaned back, voice quiet. "Deadly." "Why?" "I can't speak to their reasoning. Guess." Dr. Okoye exchanged a glance with the other doctors. "Mr. Henry, I need to be very careful how I say this. Say it." She took a breath. "A bezoar like this is a simple extraction. 15-minute procedure, outpatient, low cost." She paused. "But a complex, unresolved case of selective mutism? That's years of consultations, therapy, medications, follow-ups." She met his eyes. "Some practitioners prioritize long-term revenue over short-term solutions." The room went very, very still. "You're telling me," Larry said slowly. "They saw it. They knew. And they buried it." "I'm telling you the evidence suggests gross negligence at minimum. At worst," she stopped. "Medical malpractice cases take years to prove. But if you wanted to pursue legal action, I don't do legal." Dr. Okoye paled. Larry stood. "I want names. Every doctor who saw that mass and didn't remove it. Everyone who took my money and sent me to the next referral. Every single person who knew my son was suffering and chose to do nothing. Mr. Henry, names." 40 minutes later, Larry had a list. 7 doctors across 4 states, all of whom had noted the obstruction, none of whom had fixed it. He stared at the paper in his hand, thought about the years Dan had spent in silence, the isolation, the pain, thought about the $1 million+ he'd burned chasing cures while the answer sat in his son's throat the entire time. And he thought about Linda, the woman he'd nearly killed, the woman who'd risked everything to do what 7 experts had refused. Larry folded the list carefully, slipped it into his jacket, walked out of the hospital without another word. If you want to know what Larry does to those doctors, comment "justice" right now. And if you're terrified for Linda's life, smash that like button and share this with someone who understands what it means to stand up when no one else will. Hit subscribe. The ending will shock you. The holding room smelled like sweat and fear. Linda sat on a metal chair, wrists zip-tied in front of her, throat still bruised from Larry's hands. She didn't know how long she'd been there. Hours, maybe. Long enough for the adrenaline to fade and the terror to settle in. Long enough to accept that she wasn't walking out of here alive. The door opened. Larry Henry stepped inside. Linda's breath caught. He closed the door behind him, stared at her for a long moment, then pulled a knife from his belt. Linda closed her eyes. At least Dan can speak now. She heard footsteps, felt the cold press of steel against her wrists. The zip tie snapped. Her hands fell free. Linda's eyes flew open. Larry stood in front of her, knife still in hand, expression unreadable. "My son," he said quietly, "is going to be fine." Linda said nothing. "Because of you." He slipped the knife back into his belt. The doctors knew. For years they knew, and they let him suffer. His voice went cold. "That's on them." He looked at her. "But I almost killed the one person who gave a damn." Silence. "That's on me." Larry didn't sit, didn't soften his stance, didn't make excuses. He just stood there, looking at the woman he'd brutalized, and said the words he'd never said to anyone. "I'm sorry." Linda stared at him, throat too raw to respond, even if she'd known what to say. "I spent 8 years," Larry continued, voice low and rough, "throwing money at people who told me what I wanted to hear. That it was complicated, that it was unfixable, that I just needed to accept it." He paused. "You spent 2 weeks paying attention." Linda finally found her voice, hoarse, barely there. He was in pain. No one cared. I cared. Larry's jaw tightened. "I just didn't know how to see it." He looked down at his hands, the hands that had choked her, the hands that had built an empire on violence and fear. "I've done a lot of things I can't take back," he said. "Hurt a lot of people. But almost killing you," his voice cracked. "That would have been the worst thing I ever did." Linda swallowed. "Your son can speak now. That's what matters." "No." Larry met her eyes. "What matters is you risked your life when you didn't have to. You saw him when no one else did. And you didn't walk away." He pulled an envelope from his jacket, set it on the table beside her. "That's $50,000. It's not enough. It'll never be enough. But it's a start." Linda stared at the envelope. "I don't—" "Your mother's treatment. Her bills. Whatever you need." He stepped back. "And if you want to press charges for what I did to you, I won't fight it." Linda looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head. "I don't want your money, Mr. Henry, and I don't want revenge." She touched her bruised throat gently. "I just want to know Dan's going to be okay." Something shifted in Larry's face. "Come see for yourself. If this moment right here is breaking you, you need to subscribe right now. And if you think Linda deserves everything, comment. Hero below. Share this video with anyone who's ever been told they were wrong for caring too much. Hit that like button. The reunion will destroy you." Dan was in a private recovery room, sitting up in bed with a juice box and a notepad. When Linda walked in, his face lit up. "Linda." The word came out scratchy, uneven, but clear. She crossed to his bedside, tears already falling. "Hey, sweetheart." "I can—" He touched his throat, eyes wide with wonder. "I can talk." "You can." Linda smiled through the tears. "You can do anything now." Dan looked at his father, standing quietly in the doorway. "Dad," he said carefully, testing the word. "Thank you." Larry's throat worked. "I didn't do anything, kid. You brought me here." Dan's voice was small but steady. "You didn't leave." For the first time in 8 years, Larry crossed the room and sat on the edge of his son's bed, not hovering, not distant, just there. "I'm not going anywhere," Larry said quietly. Dan leaned into him, and Larry wrapped his arms around his son and held on like he'd just learned how. 3 months later, the house was different. Music played in the kitchen. Dan's choice, some pop song Linda had never heard, but that made him smile every time. Laughter echoed through hallways that had been silent for years. And every evening, Larry came home. Not to hide in his study, not to drink in the dark, but to sit with his son and ask about his day. Dan still went to speech therapy twice a week, still stumbled over words sometimes, still had moments where the silence felt safer than sound. But every day he got stronger. Every day he spoke a little more. And every day Larry learned how to be a father instead of a fortress. Linda stayed, not as a housekeeper, as family, because Dan had asked her to, and Larry had offered her a room, a salary, and something she hadn't had in 5 years, a place where she belonged. One Saturday morning, Linda found Dan sitting on the back porch, head tilted, eyes closed. "You okay?" she asked, sitting beside him. He nodded, smiled. "I'm listening." "To what?" "Everything." He opened his eyes. "Birds, wind, the way the leaves sound when they move." He looked at her. "I didn't know the world was this loud." Linda's chest tightened. "It's pretty great, huh?" "Yeah." Dan leaned against her shoulder. "It is." Inside, Larry stood at the window, watching them. His empire was smaller now, cleaner. He'd walked away from half his territory, cut ties with crews that dealt in ugliness he didn't want his son anywhere near. Some called it going soft. Larry didn't care, because for the first time in 8 years, his son was laughing. And no amount of power, no empire built on fear, no fortune spent on lies, could ever be worth more than that. If this story changed something in you, if it reminded you that one person paying attention can change everything, then do this. Subscribe to this channel right now, smash that like button until it breaks, and share this video with everyone you know. Comment below and tell me, will you be the person who pays attention? Will you be the Linda in someone's life? Because the world needs more people like her. Hit that notification bell. The next story is coming, and you won't want to miss it. Power couldn't save him. Fear couldn't heal him. Someone who paid attention did. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered.